The morning of the auction, there were 19 hens nobody wanted. They stood in a wire pen at the back of the Hollins County livestock yard, separated from the good stock, the way a man might separate a stack of bent nails from a box of new ones. One had a crooked beak that crossed at the tip like a pair of misaligned scissors. Two had legs that bent slightly outward, so they walked with a small rocking motion that drew the eye whether you wanted to look or not. One had only 3 toes on her left foot. One had a feather pattern that ran in the wrong direction along her back, as if she had been put together by a tired hand at the end of a long shift. The rest had something a buyer could point at and refuse, and so the auctioneer had stopped trying to sell them in the regular rotation and had set them aside for what the men at the rail called the discount pile, which was a polite way of saying the truck that hauled to the renderer would take them for next to nothing at the end of the day. Wren Asher stood at the rail with her hands in the pockets of a denim jacket 2 sizes too big, because it had belonged to her grandfather, and she had not yet decided whether to take it in. She was 22 years old. She had been back in Hollins County for 11 weeks. She had come back not because she had a plan, but because her great-aunt June had written her a letter on the back of a feed receipt that said the old place was hers if she wanted it. And Wren had folded the receipt into her wallet and driven 16 hours through 3 states without telling anyone she was leaving. She watched the 19 hens the way a person watches a river, without hurry, without comment, and when the auctioneer finally said he would take $1 a bird for the lot just to be rid of them, Wren raised one finger, and the men at the rail laughed because they thought she had misunderstood what she was bidding on. She had not. She paid $19 in crumpled bills, signed a paper that called the birds' culls, and loaded them one at a time into a cardboard box lined with straw, and the loudest man at the rail, a feed store regular named Hollis Beam, who owned 400 acres on the South Road and never let anybody forget it, leaned over and said, loud enough to carry, that the only pot those birds belonged in was the one with the lid you screwed down before you set it out for the coyotes. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It had turned out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If this story finds you somewhere quiet and you have a minute to spare, go ahead and tap the like button and drop the name of your city or town in the comments so I know where you're listening from tonight. Because what's about to happen in the next hour took place over 4 slow years on a piece of land most people in 3 counties had written off, and I think you'll want to be on record as somebody who was here for it. Now, let's begin. Wren had not grown up in Hollins County, not really, though she had spent every summer there until she was 14, when her mother had decided the drive was too far and the visits had thinned to a Christmas card. Her great-aunt June was her grandfather's younger sister, and the old place was the house and 7 acres her grandfather had bought after the war, with money he had saved by not spending any of it. The house was small, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a porch that ran the length of the south side, and behind it stood a barn that leaned a little to the east, and behind the barn stood a low stone spring house that her grandfather had built himself out of field stones he had hauled one by one in a wheelbarrow because, June said, he had not believed in borrowing anything he could carry. The spring house still ran cold water year-round from a vein that came down out of the ridge, and the barn still held the smell of decades of hay and machine oil, and the house still had her grandfather's chair by the window, and her grandfather had been dead 9 years, and the place had sat mostly empty ever since, because June lived 3 miles down the road in a trailer and only came over once a week to make sure the roof had not given up. When Wren had pulled into the gravel drive in late February with everything she owned in the back of a hatchback, June had been sitting on the porch in a coat too thin for the weather, and she had looked at Wren for a long time without standing up. And then she had said, "The key is under the 3rd stone from the door, the way it has always been." And Wren had said, "I know." And June had said, "Good." And that had been the whole of the welcome. June was 78 years old. She wore a barn coat and rubber boots without self-consciousness because she had earned the right. She spoke rarely. When she did speak, it was usually one sentence, and the sentence usually landed harder than it had any business landing. She had not asked Wren why she had come back, and Wren had not offered, and the not asking had been the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a long time. For the first 11 weeks, Wren had not done much. She had cleaned the house room by room. She had washed the windows with vinegar and torn newspaper, because that was how her grandmother had done it. She had pulled the dust cloths off the furniture and folded them and put them in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She had walked the fence line and noted which posts were rotted at the base and which were still sound. She had sat on the porch in the evenings with a cup of coffee and watched the light come down off the ridge, and she had carried a small black notebook in her back pocket and written down whatever she noticed, in handwriting so small the pages looked almost printed. She had written down the names of the trees along the creek. She had written down the times a deer crossed the back pasture. She had written down the temperature of the spring house water, which never varied more than 2 degrees in either direction, and she had underlined that number twice without quite knowing why. The chickens had been an accident, or what looked like an accident. She had gone to the auction because June had mentioned in her sideways way that the price of eggs at the county store had gotten foolish, and Wren had thought she might bring home 4 or 5 layers to put in the old coop behind the barn, which her grandfather had built with the same care he had built everything else. She had not planned to buy the rejects. She had planned to buy the kind of hens a person was supposed to buy, the uniform ones in the front pens with the straight beaks and the even feathering and the prices that climbed in measured dollars. But she had watched the 19 culls for almost an hour before the bidding got to them, and she had seen something in the way they moved that the men at the rail had not seen, because the men at the rail had been trained to see uniformity, and Wren had been trained by her grandfather on long summer afternoons she had not known were lessons to see the opposite. Her grandfather had told her once, sitting on an overturned bucket in the barn with a hen in his lap, that the birds that survived a hard winter on a hill farm were never the pretty ones. The pretty ones, he had said, were bred to look right under a light bulb. The ones that lived were the ones the breeder had thrown out, because the breeder had thrown out everything that did not match the picture in the book, and the picture in the book had been drawn by a man who had never spent a January in these hollows. Wren had been 9 years old. She had not remembered the conversation in words. She had remembered it in her hands, which knew, when she lifted each crooked hen into the cardboard box, that she was lifting something her grandfather would have nodded at. She drove home with the box on the passenger seat and the radio off, and the hens made small contented sounds the whole way, and when she pulled into the drive, June was standing at the gate of the old coop with a coil of new wire over her shoulder, as if she had known what Wren was bringing home before Wren had known it herself. June looked into the box for a long moment. She did not smile. She said, "Those are the ones," and Wren said, "I think so," and June handed her the wire and walked back to her truck without another word, and the truck started on the second try and rattled off down the gravel with the engine composing its own obituary the whole way to the county road. Wren watched the dust settle. Then she carried the box to the coop and set the hens down one at a time on the clean straw she had laid that morning, and the crooked beak hen walked 3 steps and turned and looked at her with one yellow eye, and Wren wrote in the notebook 19 and underlined it once and closed the cover. The first month she lost 2. One went down with something quick that she could not name, and one wandered off in a thunderstorm and did not come back, and Wren buried the first one under the apple tree at the edge of the pasture and left the second one to whatever had taken her, because her grandfather had also told her, in the same summer on the same bucket, that a hen that wandered in a storm had made a decision and you owed her the dignity of it. The other 17 settled. They learned the coop and the run and the patch of grass under the elder bush where the bugs were thickest in the afternoon. They learned Wren's footsteps. The crooked beak hen, whom Wren did not name because she had decided not to name any of them, and then almost immediately decided to name one of them, and then held the line at almost, took to following Wren around the yard like a small uneven shadow, and Wren found on the morning of the 23rd day the first egg in the nest box. brown and small and slightly pointed at one end, and she stood in the dim of the coop with the egg in her palm for longer than she would have admitted, and then she put it in her jacket pocket and walked back to the house, and she did not eat it. She set it on the kitchen windowsill in a small blue cup, and she wrote in the notebook first and underlined it twice, and went to put on a pot of coffee. By the end of April, the 17 hens were laying steadily, more than a dozen eggs most mornings, and Wren was eating eggs for breakfast and for lunch and sometimes for dinner. And she was giving the surplus to June, who took them without comment and brought back the next week an empty carton and a jar of homemade apple butter that had no label on it. The eggs were not uniform. Some were brown, some were cream, some were a pale greenish blue that Wren had not expected from any of the birds she had bought. And one hen, the one with the 3 toes, laid an egg every other day that was nearly the size of a duck's, with a shell so thick Wren had to tap it twice with a knife to crack it. Wren wrote everything down. She wrote down which hen laid which egg, on which day, in which weather. And at the end of the month she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and looked at the columns of small numbers and saw a pattern she had not been looking for, which was that the crooked, the bent, the mismatched birds her grandfather had told her about were laying through cold snaps and heat spells and the windy days that knocked the regular layers off their rhythm at any farm she had ever visited. And they were laying eggs whose yolks, when she cracked them into a white bowl, stood up so tall and orange they looked like small suns. She made an omelet for June one Sunday, and June ate it slowly and set down her fork and said, "Your grandfather kept birds like these once." And Wren said, "I know." And June said, "He stopped because the feed store quit carrying the kind of grain he wanted." And Wren said, "What kind of grain?" And June looked at her for a long time and said, "It's in the ledger in the spring house, on the shelf above the door." And Wren had not known there was a ledger in the spring house, and June did not explain further, because June rarely did. The ledger was a hardbound green book with a cracked spine, and Wren found it that same afternoon on the shelf above the door, where June had said it would be, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a piece of baling twine. Inside, in her grandfather's careful slanting handwriting, were 43 years of notes on every bird he had ever kept, every grain he had ever fed, every cross he had ever made between a hen he had bought cheap and a rooster he had borrowed from a neighbor. And on the last page, dated 3 months before he died, were 3 lines that read, "The birds the breeders throw out are the birds that built this country. The eggs they lay are the eggs my mother fed us on. And if anyone ever asks you what to do with them, tell them to make a pie." Wren read the 3 lines twice. She closed the ledger. She put it back on the shelf above the door, and she walked out into the late afternoon light and stood for a long time at the edge of the pasture with her hands in the pockets of her grandfather's jacket, and the crooked beak hen came across the grass and stood beside her boot and made a small churring sound, and Wren said, "All right," out loud, to no one in particular, and went inside to find her grandmother's recipe box. The recipe box was a tin one, painted with faded roses, and it had sat on top of the refrigerator for as long as Wren could remember. She took it down and set it on the kitchen table and opened it, and the cards inside were yellowed at the edges and stained with grease and butter, and once, on a card for biscuits, what looked like a single drop of dried blood from a small kitchen cut taken decades ago. The pot pie recipe was near the back, written on a card that had been folded in half and unfolded so many times it had nearly torn along the crease. It was titled, in her grandmother's round handwriting, "Sunday Pot Pie," and the ingredients were short and unsurprising, except for one note at the bottom, in the same handwriting but in a different ink, that said, "Crust with lard from the back hog, broth from the bones of the old hens, eggs from the crooked ones for the wash, no shortcuts, no apologies." Wren read the card 3 times. She put it on the windowsill next to the blue cup that still held the first egg, which she had blown out and kept, and she stood at the window and watched the light fall across the pasture, and she made a list on a fresh page of the notebook, a list of what she would need and what she already had. And the list was longer than she had hoped and shorter than she had feared. She did not start that week. She did not start the next week either. She spent May reading the ledger from the first page to the last, slowly, in the evenings. By the light of a lamp her grandfather had wired himself from a kerosene base he had refused to throw out when the electric had come through. She learned, page by page, that her grandfather had kept 26 different small flocks across 43 years, that he had bred for hardiness and for the color of the yolk and for the willingness of the hen to set on her own eggs in March, and that he had fed them, in the years when the feed store still carried it, a mix of cracked corn and field peas and a little roasted barley, and that when the feed store had stopped carrying field peas because nobody wanted them anymore, he had grown his own in the half-acre patch behind the barn, which Wren had walked past every day for 11 weeks without knowing what it had once been. She walked out to the patch on the first warm evening in May and knelt in the grass and pushed her fingers down into the soil. And the soil was darker than the soil in the rest of the pasture. The way ground is darker where something has been grown well for a long time, and she wrote in the notebook peas and underlined it and went back to the house to order seed. The peas went in the first week of June, planted by hand in rows. Wren laid out with a string and 2 stakes the way her grandfather had laid out everything, and June came over on the second day of planting and stood at the edge of the patch with her hands in her coat pockets and watched for a while, and then walked into the patch and knelt down beside Wren and began to plant the next row without saying anything. And the 2 of them planted together until the light was gone, and June stood up and brushed the dirt off her knees and said, "He would have liked this." And Wren said, "I know." And June walked back to her truck and drove off, and Wren stayed in the patch until the stars came out, listening to the hens settling in the coop behind her and the creek running along the back fence and the small night sounds of a place that had been waiting a long time for someone to come back to it. The peas came up in 9 days. By the end of July, they were knee-high and flowering, and by the end of August, Wren was shelling them on the porch in the evenings with a tin bowl in her lap and the crooked beak hen at her feet, eating the empty pods one at a time as if she had been promised them in a contract. And Wren was mixing the peas with cracked corn she bought at the mill on the county road, and with barley she roasted herself in a cast-iron pan on the stove, and the hens were eating the mix, and the yolks were getting darker, and the eggs were getting larger, and the ledger in the spring house was getting a new page in handwriting that almost, but not quite, matched her grandfather's. She made the first pot pie on the second Sunday of September. She did it in her grandmother's blue enamel roaster, with a crust she rolled out on the kitchen table using a wine bottle because she had not yet found her grandmother's rolling pin. And she filled it with the meat of a hen who had stopped laying in July and had been kept on for exactly this purpose, and with carrots and onions and the last of the peas, and a broth she had simmered for 9 hours on the back of the stove from the bones and the feet, and a handful of herbs from the patch by the kitchen door, and she brushed the top crust with a wash made from one of the 3-toed hen's enormous eggs, and she baked it in the oven that her grandmother had warned, in a note pinned inside the recipe box, ran 20 degrees hot on the left side, and she took it out at the exact moment the crust on the left side went from gold to the gold just before brown. She set it on the windowsill to cool. She called June. June came over in 20 minutes. They ate it at the kitchen table with 2 forks and 1 plate between them, because June said any pie worth eating was worth eating off the same plate as the person who made it, and they ate in silence for a long time. And when the plate was empty, June set down her fork and looked at Wren and said, "You will need a bigger oven," and Wren said, "I know," and June said, "Not yet," and Wren said, "I know that too." She sold the first one on a Saturday in October. She had baked 4 that morning, in 2 batches, in the oven that ran hot on the left, and she had loaded them into the back of her hatchback in their roasters wrapped in towels, and she had driven to the parking lot of the county store on the highway, where June had told her, without explaining how she knew, that there would be a flea market that weekend with a table available for $10. Wren paid the $10 to a man in a folding chair who did not look up from his crossword. and she set up a card table with a paper sign she had written in pencil that said, "Pot pie, $5 a slice, $8 a whole small." And she sat behind the table on a folding stool with her hands in her jacket pockets and waited. For the first hour, nobody stopped. People walked past and looked at the sign and looked at Wren and walked on, because she was new and the sign was plain. And there were 3 other tables selling jam, and one selling birdhouses, and one selling a kind of fudge that had been at every flea market in the county for 20 years. At 10:15, a woman with a toddler on her hip stopped and asked for a slice and gave Wren a $5 bill and a $20 bill and asked her to keep the 20 because the slice was the best thing she had eaten since her own grandmother died. And she said it without crying but with a small catch in her voice that Wren felt in her own throat. And the woman walked away with the slice on a paper plate and a plastic fork. And 20 minutes later she came back with her husband and her father and a neighbor she had called on the phone, and they bought the remaining 3 slices of that pie and one of the whole smalls. And the husband, who was a long, thin man in a feed store cap, asked Wren what she put in it, and Wren said, "My grandmother's recipe." And the husband said, "Your grandmother was a serious woman." And Wren said, "Yes, she was." By noon she had sold all 4 pies and was taking names on the back of a paper bag for the next Saturday. By 2, she had taken 12 names. By the time she packed up the table at 4, the paper bag was full on both sides, and she had been asked 3 times whether she had a storefront and 4 times whether she did weddings, and once by an older man in a clean white shirt, whether she had ever considered selling the recipe, which she had answered with a smile and a no. So gentle the man had laughed and said he had figured. She drove home with the empty roasters rattling in the back and the radio off and the windows down, and the air coming in off the ridge smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke and the particular cold sweetness of October in the hollows. And when she pulled into the drive, June was on the porch in the rocker with a cup of coffee, and Wren held up the paper bag, and June nodded once and went back to her coffee, and Wren went inside to start the broth for the next week. By November, she was baking 10 pies a Saturday. By December, she was baking 16, and had started taking orders by phone on a number she had written on a new paper sign, and was turning away as many orders as she filled, because the oven that ran hot on the left could only hold 2 pies at a time, and she would not, she had decided, bake a pie. She had not watched the whole way through. Word moved the way word moves in a county like Holland's, which is to say through the gas station on the corner of Route 9, where a woman named Darlene worked the register on weekday afternoons and told every customer who came in for a lottery ticket about the pie she had eaten the Saturday before, and through the kitchen of the diner across from the courthouse, where the cook, a man named Esau who happened to be June's second cousin, started telling his regulars that there was a girl out on the old Asher place who was making the pot pie his aunt used to make in 1962, and through the back pew of the Baptist church on the ridge, where 2 sisters in their 70s had agreed, after eating 1 slice between them on a Tuesday, that the girl had the touch and that the touch could not be taught, and that anyone who said otherwise had never had the touch themselves. None of this was marketing. Wren did not have a website. She did not have a social media account. She had a paper sign and a phone number and a notebook full of small, careful numbers, and the line at the card table at the flea market on Saturdays had begun, by the second week of December, to stretch from her table past the jam table and past the birdhouse table and past the fudge table and out into the gravel of the parking lot. And the man with the crossword had started charging her $20 for the table instead of 10, and had stopped pretending not to recognize her. Hollis Beam came to the flea market on the 3rd Saturday in January. He came in his good coat, which was the coat he wore to funerals and to the bank, and he stood at the back of the line for 40 minutes without speaking to anyone. And when he got to the front, he asked for a whole small and paid with a 20, and waited for the change and put the change in the donation jar Wren kept for the volunteer fire department, and he carried the pie back to his truck without looking at her, and drove off. And Wren wrote in the notebook HB and did not underline it. The next Saturday he came again. He came every Saturday in February. On the first Saturday in March, When the line was long enough that the man with the crossword had given up his folding chair and was directing traffic, Hollis Beam waited his turn and came to the front of the table and set down his 20 and said quietly, so that only Wren could hear, "I was wrong about those birds." And Wren said, "That's all right." And Hollis said, "No, it isn't." And Wren said, "Well." And Hollis said, "My wife says if you ever need a bigger oven, I have one in the back of the equipment barn that came out of the old school cafeteria when they remodeled in '89, and it works, and you can have it for what I paid for it, which was nothing." And Wren said, "I'll let you know." And Hollis nodded once and took his pie and walked back to his truck, and he did not make a large production out of it. And Wren wrote in the notebook, "Oven," and underlined it once. She took the oven in April. Hollis brought it over himself in the bed of a flatbed he borrowed from a neighbor, and he and 2 of his sons unloaded it onto the concrete slab Wren had poured behind the barn with June's help on a weekend in March. And they wired it into the panel Wren had paid an electrician from the next county over to upgrade. And when they were done, Hollis stood back and looked at the oven, which was a 6-rack commercial gas oven the color of a battleship, and he said, "That will hold 12 pies at a time if you stagger them." And Wren said, "I know." And Hollis said, "I figured you did." And he tipped his cap and got in the flatbed and drove off. And his sons followed in a pickup. And June, who had been sitting on a bucket the whole time watching without comment, stood up and walked over to the oven and put her hand flat against the door and said, "Your grandfather would have laughed." And Wren said, "Why?" And June said, "Because he tried to buy that exact oven from the school in '89, and they would not sell it to him." And Wren laughed for the first time, June said later, in a way that sounded like her grandfather, and Wren did not know what to say to that. So she put her hand on the door of the oven next to June's and did not say anything at all. The line down the road started in May. By then Wren had given up the flea market table and was baking out of the barn, which she and June and a teenager named Cal from down the road had spent 6 weekends cleaning and reframing and insulating. With a new prep counter along the long wall and a hand-washing sink, Cal had plumbed himself under the supervision of his uncle, who was a retired pipe fitter from Wheeling, and who had refused payment on the condition that Wren send a pie home with Cal every Friday for the rest of his natural life, a condition Wren had agreed to without negotiation. The barn was not a restaurant. Wren had no interest in being a restaurant. It was a kitchen and a window cut into the south wall, and a wooden shelf below the window where the pies came out, and a hand-painted sign nailed to the post by the gravel turnaround that said simply, "Pies Saturday, 9 to 1, cash or check." And the first Saturday she opened the window at 9 sharp. There were already 11 cars in the drive, and the line ran from the window across the gravel and down the slope to the mailbox at the county road. And by 10 the line had reached the bend in the road where the old sycamore leaned out over the asphalt. And Cal, who had been hired on properly now at $10 an hour and a pie a week, came around the corner of the barn with his eyes a little wide and said, "There are people parking at the church and walking down," and Wren said, "All right," and kept pulling pies. She sold 84 that day. She had baked 86, and she gave 1 to June and 1 to Cal. And she closed the window at 12:40 because there was nothing left to sell. And the last 6 people in line were disappointed but not surprised, because Darlene at the gas station had been telling everyone for 2 weeks that the girl out on the old Asher place sold out by noon, and you had better come early. And the 6 of them put their names on the list for the next Saturday and drove off without complaint. And one of them, a woman from 2 counties over, who had driven an hour and 10 minutes, asked Wren if she could leave a deposit. And Wren said, "No, ma'am, the list is the list." And the woman had laughed and said, "My grandmother would have liked you." And Wren had said, "Thank you. That's a kind thing to say," and meant it. The line got longer through June and into July. By the middle of July, the county sheriff, a soft-spoken man named Aldous, who had grown up 2 ridges over and had known Wren's grandfather well enough to have hunted with him twice, came out to the place on a Wednesday afternoon and stood on the porch with his hat in his hand and told Wren, with some apology in his voice, that the line on Saturdays had started to back traffic up on Route 9, and that he was going to have to either ticket somebody or help her fix it, and he would prefer to help her fix it. They sat on the porch for an hour with a pitcher of iced tea between them and worked out a plan in pencil on the back of an envelope, which was that Aldous would send a deputy out on Saturday mornings to direct cars into the back pasture, which Wren would mow flat for parking, and Wren would, in exchange, donate 10 pies a month to the volunteer fire department's monthly community supper, which she had been doing already without anyone asking her to, and Aldous would call it square, and Aldous stood up and put his hat on and said, "Your grandfather would be proud of you," and Wren said, "I hope so," and Aldous said, "I know so," and walked down the steps to his cruiser and drove off, and Wren sat on the porch for a long time after he left, watching the light come down off the ridge, and the crooked-beak hen who had become, despite Wren's intentions, an animal with a name, which was Iris, came up the steps and stood beside her boot, and Wren reached down and put her hand on the hen's back. And the hen made the small churring sound she had made on the first day, and Wren wrote in the notebook, "Traffic," and underlined it once, and closed the cover. August came hot and dry. The peas in the patch behind the barn did poorly in the heat, and Wren spent her evenings carrying water in 2 galvanized cans from the spring house to the rows because the well pump was old, and she did not want to lean on it, and June came over twice a week and carried water alongside her without being asked. And they did not talk much because there was not much to say that the work was not already saying. On the last Sunday in August, June did not come over. Wren waited until 11 and then drove down to the trailer, and June was in the kitchen at the small table with a cup of coffee in front of her that had gone cold, and she looked at Wren when Wren came in and said, "I'm going to sit a while today." And Wren said, "All right," and made a fresh pot of coffee and sat with her. And they sat for 2 hours without much talking, and at one point June said, "The ledger has a back section you have not gotten to yet." And Wren said, "I have not." And June said, "When you do not be in a hurry about it." And Wren said, "I won't." And June nodded and closed her eyes for a while, and when she opened them she said, "You should get back. The hens will be wanting their evening feed." And Wren stood up and washed both cups and put them in the rack and drove home. And she did not know then that it was the last conversation of any length she would have with June, who went into the hospital in Elkins on the second Tuesday of September with a pain in her side and did not come back out. June died on the 3rd Friday of September in the early morning, with Wren in the chair beside the bed and a nurse in the doorway who had the good sense to step back into the hall. Wren had been there for 16 hours. She had read aloud, in the last 2 of them, from the green ledger, which she had brought with her in a canvas bag. And she had read the entries about the flock of 1971, which June had helped her brother raise the summer she was 30, and June had not been able to speak by then, but had squeezed Wren's hand once at the end of a long entry about a particular hen named Pearl, who had laid through 3 winters without missing a week, and the squeeze had been answer enough. Wren stayed in the room for an hour after the nurse came in, and then she signed what she had to sign and drove home in the gray light of the early morning, and she fed the hens and let them out into the run, and she sat on the porch in her grandfather's jacket with the ledger in her lap, and she did not cry, because June had not been a person who would have wanted her to, not yet anyway, not before the work of the day was done. She baked that Saturday. She had thought briefly about closing the window, and had decided against it because June, she knew with a certainty she could not have explained, would have considered closing the window a kind of vanity. She baked 30 pies that morning instead of the usual 80, because she had not had the heart to prep for more on Friday, and she put a small sign in the window that said, "June Asher, 1946 to this week, thank you for being kind to her." And she opened at 9, and the line was already past the mailbox, and the first person at the window, a woman Wren did not know, read the sign and reached through the window and took Wren's hand and held it for a moment and did not say anything, and the second person did the same, and the third, and by the 20th pie, Wren had stopped being able to look up, and Cal, who had come in without being asked and was working the boxes, was wiping his eyes on the sleeve of his shirt between customers, and Hollis Beam, who had come at the end of the line on purpose and had been standing in the gravel for an hour and 40 minutes, got to the window last and set down his 20 and said, "She was the best of them." And Wren said, "Yes, she was." And Hollis said, "You keep going." And Wren said, "I plan to." And Hollis took his pie and walked to his truck and drove off, and Wren closed the window and sat down on the wooden stool inside the barn and put her hands flat on the prep counter and breathed for a long time. And Iris, who had snuck in through the back door the way she always did when she thought Wren needed her, came across the concrete floor and stood beside the stool and made the small churring sound, and Wren reached down and picked her up and held her against the front of the denim jacket, and the hen settled against her with a small, soft weight, and Wren stayed like that until the light through the south window had moved across the counter and onto the floor, and then she stood up and started the broth for the next week. The back section of the ledger was 22 pages, and Wren read it that night by the lamp her grandfather had wired from the kerosene base, and the 22 pages were not entries about hens at all. They were a letter, written in pieces over the last year of her grandfather's life, addressed to whoever came back to the place, and the letter said, in plain language and without ceremony, that the place had been bought with patience and built with patience, and that it would only ever be kept with patience, and that anyone who tried to make it more than it was would lose it, and that anyone who tried to make it less than it was would lose it too, and that the right size for the place was the size at which the person running it could still walk every row of the patch in an evening and know every bird in the coop by sight, and that beyond that size, the place would stop being the place and start being a business. And a business was a fine thing for someone else to have, but not for this ground, which had been bought for a different reason, which was that a man home from the war had wanted, for the rest of his life, to wake up and walk out the back door and see something he had grown himself, and that was all, and that was enough. The letter ended with one line, which read, "Tell June I knew she would bring whoever was meant to come," and Wren read the line 3 times, and she closed the ledger, and she sat for a long time in the lamplight, and she understood, the way a person understands something they have been moving toward without knowing it, that the bigger oven was the right size, and the next oven would not be, and that she would keep the window open 4 hours a Saturday and not 5, and that she would not take wholesale orders from the restaurant in Charleston that had called twice in August, and that she would instead teach Cal everything she knew slowly over the years, and that Cal would, if he wanted, take it on when she was ready to step back, and that the place would go on being the place, and the line would go on being the line, and the hens would go on being the hens until they were not, and then there would be other hens, and the ledger would keep getting new pages, and that would be the whole of it, and the whole of it would be enough. She closed the lamp. She went out onto the porch in the dark. The ridge was a black shape against a sky full of cold stars, and the creek was running along the back fence the way it had run the night her grandfather had bought the place, and the night June had handed her the coil of wire, and the night the first egg had come, and the night she had sold the first pie, and Wren stood at the rail of the porch in her grandfather's jacket and put her hands in the pockets, and in the right pocket her fingers found the folded feed receipt that June had written the invitation on, which she had kept there the whole time without quite remembering she was keeping it, and she took it out and unfolded it and read it once in the starlight, and she folded it back up and put it back in the pocket, and she went inside to sleep because morning would come early, and there was always more to do, and the doing was the point.